Hi, I'm Claire Williamson, an ex-litigator and the co-founder of Leading Minds. With 97% of lawyers complaining that stress is impacting their health, I think it's time that we speak about how challenging the pressures of the legal industry can be. So this podcast is a space where lawyers can discuss how they've overcome the challenges they face in their role and gone on to thrive within their career. Whether you're a trainee, a partner, or anyone in between, I really hope that this podcast will leave you feeling inspired, empowered, and with the confidence that you can leave your mark on the legal industry. So today I'm very excited to be joined by Harry Clark, a trainee at Baker McKenzie and the host of the incredible More From Law podcast. So today Harry is going to be sharing what led him to start the podcast and how using goal setting is really key to get what you want in both career and your life as well. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Claire. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Is it weird to be the guest rather than the host?
I've not done it too. I think this is maybe number 4 or 5 for me, but yeah, versus 70 odd episodes I've been on the other side of the mic, it's always a little bit strange, but no, I do enjoy it. It makes things up a bit.
Good. And I thought it'd be interesting maybe for our listeners, if you can maybe just give us a quick introduction to where you studied and how you ended up at Baker McKenzie.
Yeah, of course. So I studied law at the University of York for 3 years, and then obviously went on to do the LPC earlier this year in January, and then started with Baker's about a month or 2 ago now. So fresh face in the world of law. And like, a lot of applicants and students and aspiring lawyers that I try to sort of help and mentor and speak to. I went through the sort of application process, multiple application cycles whilst I was at the University of York. And ended up securing my TC offer going into my 3rd year at York. So the whole process was just one big trial and error, I think. And I think that that's something that a lot of people I've spoken to will attest to, whether they've secured something or not, is the whole process of applying for training contracts or vacation schemes or anything else is markedly different from the, I guess you would call, sort of standard format of submit a cover letter and a CV and, hopefully get an interview sort of thing. There's a lot more sort of hoops to jump through. There's these really strange tests and concepts you've never heard of before, like the Watson-Glaser test and commercial awareness and all this stuff. So it's certainly a learning process by self-discovery. And that in turn feeds into it being frustrating and confusing and demoralizing and everything else in between at times when it doesn't quite go your way. Which is why I think kind of conversations like this to show that it's, it's obviously doable, but it's not like a kind of easy, you walk in the door and it's done. There's a kind of a self-inflicted kind of challenge of trial and error that you go through as well, is really important and feeds into everything from imposter syndrome to your sort of confidence and anxieties and everything else in an interview and everything in between.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting that you've actually mentioned that, because I do think that people do really, struggle with the application process, because it does just feel like that balance between saying what you think people want to hear versus being yourself. And did you ever find that when you were making applications? I must actually admit that I was one of those people at the time that I applied. Slaughter May did want a CV and a cover letter. And I know everyone is just hating me now. So I did get a training contract off the back of a very fluky cover letter and CV, which God knows what it must have said on it. But yeah, I do think that, finding that balance between showing what you think people want to hear and what you are as a person is really, really difficult. So how did you find that balance?
Yeah, it's really tough. I think, especially now, I've kind of helped review people's applications, or I've just come across other future trainee solicitors and heard their stories and things. It's only now, with the power of hindsight, I can identify all of the cliches that you probably relied upon and all the mistakes that I made, especially in my first few rounds. So, catchphrases like law is intellectually stimulating, or I want to work for this firm because it has this many offices and this many places, not always kind of really understanding the core kind of message that recruiters are looking for when I've interviewed them on my podcast, which is almost like a story, your motivations and your persuasions for wanting to not just do law, but to do commercial law, or to do commercial law with these given tenets of being international or being in this sort of specialism or something, and at that firm or at that company or whatever kind of spectrum of sort of applications or types of things you're applying for. And I think as a student and as an applicant, it's so hard to wrap your head around that, because like I said, it's a very different process. It's not covered by your core curriculum in the way that your academics are. And in all honesty, there's not really a kind of golden ticket, this is the way to do it. Everyone's experiences are very different. There are people who will apply 50 times and eventually get something, versus people who will either strike lucky or anything in between and do it once and they're done. So everything I've been trying to do is at least pass on the mistakes that I know I made, because I made a few. And in any other circumstance, try to get other people, recruiters or specialists in their field or anyone else, to kind of share their insights, because I think there's so much more to being a lawyer and to understanding what they do beyond what you're initially exposed to at an undergraduate level. And personally, I don't see any reason why some of the concepts you get introduced to on the LPC or what you might experience during a training contract and anything else can't be kind of pushed further ahead of or down that line of your sort of educational development and your timeline in a way that's accessible and understandable, at least where you're currently at in an undergraduate degree or equivalent.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to say that as well, because I think there was almost quite a naivety to my application process, is that I didn't go to one of the the kind of top universities. I studied at Aberdeen. I was first in my family to go to university. So I think in some ways I actually it was a bit of a blessing in disguise that I didn't realize that it was really, really difficult. So I just kind of was plodding along doing my thing. Whereas now I think there's so much kind of awareness around about how challenging it can be. And I think that social media can be a really good thing for that, but also it can be quite difficult when we're looking at people on Instagram or, on LinkedIn and thinking, hold on, they've just been offered one. What have they done? I should try and kind of do what they're doing. And then the other side of that is when people like yourself are, bringing out amazing, podcasts, or like the Corporate Law Academy with Jason Sutton, or, Grow Mentoring as well. All of these things are really good resources. So I think it's kind of it's definitely a balance to be had between looking at what you're doing and maybe getting a bit too distracted by what other people are doing as well.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, that exactly what we were talking about. I never used LinkedIn or any of these resources or sites or anything that much, outside of my write out to an application or anything else during this time. And there was still, because of just the discussions you have on a day-to-day basis with your fellow cohort and your classmates and everything else, there's still that kind of self-imposed picture of where you should be at in your career and what you should know among students, in a way which I think is, especially looking back now, completely disproportionate to a lot of the realities of the legal profession. So like the first time I heard the fact that the average age of a qualifying solicitor is 29 just really stunned me, because I think throughout all of university, throughout your studies, either through just almost like a form of peer pressure or sort of social conditioning in terms of this is where I need to be and this is what I need to do right now. I never kind of assumed that, and I never realized that there were so many different avenues into law, that there's so many different types of things available beyond training contracts or vacation schemes that you might hear at your campus. And that also, in hindsight, that at York I was very fortunate. I had access to a careers advisor who was solely based within law. I had these firms come to my campus for law affairs and events and everything else. And not all students get that, as you say, based on where they're studying. So I think if there's one thing which COVID-19 I think has done really well, it's begun to democratize access to law firms and to these kind of internal events. So rather than only being able to appear at certain universities, either just on a scheduling or capacity basis or preference or anything else, you have online webinars and events and resources now. You have podcasts and discussions like these where people can tune in and hear a thought on a given topic. And I think I hope that firms will kind of anticipate and realize that this is a really good avenue and opportunity to reach students and people they might not have met before post-pandemic, and continue to sort of implement that into the ways they're looking to engage with potential talent.
Yeah. And so tell me about your podcast. Where did the idea come from, and because you actually started it before you'd accept your your training contract, but you hadn't actually entered the legal industry. So what motivated you to start the podcast?
Yeah, I think to answer that, I'll go slightly even further back and say that sort of in September time, I kind of started doing all this stuff in terms of, taking Skype calls with people and starting to try to pass on the mistakes I made and say, don't make these, and speaking to other lawyers and interviewing them in a blog format and everything else. And the main driving force behind that was actually through LinkedIn. So I was trying to clear some space on my phone. I opened up LinkedIn because I just never used it for anything other than being a digital CV, and even that was out of date. And when I opened it up, I saw a lot of the messages which I saw, a year or two before that day, of saying, very understandably, people going, "I'm delighted to announce this. I'm delighted to have accepted that." And I just know that social media, like we sort of said earlier, isn't always indicative of the entire market out there. And reading messages like that when you've just been through a rejection or something can really make it feel like everyone but you has kind of succeeded or achieved something or done well or anything else. And so I made a short post on that basis, and it sort of went really viral, and I started to try to connect to people. And it's just sort of a case of trying to think about, what would I have really wanted 2 years before where I am now? And at that time, it was just an insight into what goes on in the application process. And that's sort of since evolved into, well, what are all the things that I've since learned, either through the LPC or through all these conversations I'm starting to have with people in my network, that I didn't know about at all during university. And that kind of led to the introduction of the podcast, where I thought, well, students love the idea of feedback from recruiters. They want to know where they've gone wrong. They'd love an opportunity to sit down with a partner and ask them about what their practice area is like, or they want to be able to sit down with a technology expert and say, this is how AI or legal tech is changing the world of law. And I was very fortunate enough, I was starting to have those people come into my network through what I was doing on social media. And I just thought, well, I only know so much, and I'm curious to learn as well. So why don't I bring in all these people who are leading at what they do, not just from a quote unquote traditionally legal perspective, but bring in, social media or branding experts to talk about networking, or to bring in sort of stress coaches to talk about well-being, and everything else kind of connected to the legal profession beyond just your academic studies, which led to the name More From Law. And it's been a really enjoyable journey, both for me to learn throughout each conversation, but also the messages I receive from people saying how much they enjoy it ever since, really.
Amazing. And I can also imagine it's been quite a time-consuming journey.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll realize this is I think the podcast, I always kind of went in thinking you just hit record, talk for a bit, hit stop and send it. But I'm sure, Claire, you've kind of realized this when it comes to trying to running one. There is so much more groundwork that goes into it in terms of the initial discussion of saying, well, what am I even going to begin to talk about? Getting all of the kind of branding and the naming and everything, scheduling all your guests, all this kind of stuff. It really was, I think, in a way, especially when I was doing it, the capacity I was during the LPC, a bit of a side job that you have to really dedicate some hours to. And you're right, it was time consuming, and especially alongside the accelerated LPC. I won't lie that there were a lot of long hour work days at times, but I think the main thing which kind of stopped that being too overwhelming was the fact that I didn't view the podcast or anything else I was doing as work, because I wanted to do it and I found it enjoyable. And I think the second I either lost interest or someone told me I would have to do it, then it would bring in all the undue stress on me, because I feel like as if I'm kind of having to live up to someone else's expectations or something like that. So no, it was long hours and a lot of work, but I think over time you become more efficient. You start to develop better ways of working, and the whole process teaches you so many skills that I think, running any kind of little side project like that, that I never would have anticipated when I got started, really.
Yeah. And since then, have you noticed that since you've entered the legal environment as a trainee, that you have got an additional skill set that you maybe wouldn't have had you not run the podcast? And has anyone kind of commented on that, or has it been a factor that people have wanted to speak to you about because you've had it?
Yeah, I think on the first point of kind of skill development, certainly time management is one which has been really, really prevalent to what you do as a trainee. I think on the LPC and during your academic studies, you might have one ongoing task, like a piece of coursework or a dissertation, or like a kind of series of seminars you're preparing for, which are either very standardized and or longer in scope in terms of how long you have to complete them or when they're due. And I think the main difference between that style of thinking and as a trainee is that you may have a few ongoing matters like that, but at the same time, you might just have these smaller, I think we call them moles in our department, because it's like a whack-a-mole, things that just kind of come up and you need to just kind of deal with it and then put it away. And it certainly gave me a good framework. I've obviously since had to adjust, but that's been really helpful. And on the second point, in terms of how it's been sort of received within the firm, I mean, like even before I joined, I was really thankful to have members of graduate recruitment of the firm come in and talk about their tips for vacation schemes, their tips for training contracts, and their kind of what they look for in trainees. And I think the main thing I'm really excited about now is that now I'm kind of within this ecosystem with other lawyers, and not just lawyers, but business development people and everyone in between. There's a huge kind of potential pool of guests or people who will know people that I can start to refer to in the industry, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think, you know, it's so phenomenal for you as your reputation within the legal industry. But what would you, and you know, it's obviously like kind of really helped you make those connections and build your network. But what would you say to people who are maybe concerned that they don't have a blog or a podcast or a website, you know, and that they're just kind of doing their thing? You know, do you think, because I think often it's easy to get almost looking at other people and thinking, oh my God, but they're doing all this, I should be doing this too. And I get it too. Like I looked at your podcast, and I was like, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't have just focused on this area. I should be doing this, you know? So what would you say to those people?
Yeah, it goes back to that point we made earlier in terms of the reality versus the kind of what you perceive to be where you should be at. And I think just you say, do your own thing. This is by no, it feels a bit weird saying this is by no means a prerequisite to being successful in any degree, either in an application or anything else. And I do it because it interests me. I mean, in the same manner that people might say, oh, I need to start a blog or a podcast or anything else. I mean, they might be getting involved with initiatives that I'm not going to be able to do on a time basis, like lots of sporting activities or running something that's kind of extracurricular outside the world of law, or they'll be able to kind of spend more time researching, analyzing other topics in a way that I won't be able to. So I think that the main thing is just to kind of be really passionate and interested about how you delegate your time outside of the stuff which you will inevitably have to do, whether that's work or studies on a day-to-day basis. And whatever it is that you do, try to find ways to extract the most out of yourself in terms of your own personal development. And if it's for the purposes of applications, think about the quote unquote transferable skills, which you pick up along the way and how that would be relevant to what a trainee or a lawyer might be doing. But no, by no means a prerequisite, and focus on your own path and journey, really.
Yeah, and I think that's so true as well, isn't it? And I remember one thing I really was torn about when I was in the legal industry is like finding that balance between being like enough of myself so I felt comfortable and happy, but also you know, within myself and within what I was doing, but also kind of trying to fit the mold of what a trainee should be and what they should be doing, and looking at people around me and thinking, oh, I should be doing that, or rugby, should I take up rugby because people seem impressed by that? It's like, but madness, isn't it? And even this week, someone that I kind of mentor kind of informally, she, you know, was really concerned about fitting into the box for the application process, and we had a chat, and she actually kind of did it completely different. And she said, I was just felt so much more myself because I was honest, I was open, and she actually had a much more positive response as well. So I do think that it can be easy to think, what does this person want? But I think if you truly want to find, you know, long-term fulfillment within a firm, it also has to work for you. You know, it's not just a case of them interviewing you, it's you interviewing them. And I know that's easy to say whilst you're in the middle of like a global pandemic and everyone's going to be concerned about the availability of jobs. But I do think it has to be a fit, or else you are going to find it's just unsustainable, because you're not going to be working in an environment which feels right to you. So if it does take you a bit longer, if you have an alternative career into the legal path, into the legal sector, I don't think that's negative. I would say there's very few people I've interviewed, probably you and me or one, or like literally the few that have had that kind of quite traditional route in. You know, most people, I would say like 95% of people on the podcast, they've had an alternative route and it's worked really well for them.
Yeah, and that's reflected in my own cohort as well, Bakers. I think I'm one of the youngest, or one of the only people who, yeah, there's lots of people who've done GDL, lots of people who've been paralegals or done recruitment before. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It is I get your point, almost a bit difficult to say, but it is a two-way process. And I've heard experiences of people and students in my network who will go to an assessment center and not enjoy it. And it's really hard to kind of fake genuine passion. And if you're, you know, whether it's talking about a recent news story which interests you and how it relates to a firm, or just the very kind of core values of a firm or a given kind of legal role and what it does, you're only really going to be able to sort of fuse that to a recruiter if you're genuine and sort of passionate. It's very hard to kind of fake that natural energy in an interview room or elsewhere. And so you're absolutely right. You need to make sure that it's a good fit for you as well.
Yeah. And you are, as you said, kind of one of the younger kind of members, and you have gone down the traditional route and you've achieved quite a lot. And we spoke before when we had our kind of pre-call, also insight into the podcasting world, that you're clearly very ambitious, very driven, and you said a lot how goal setting and kind of self-analysis, that was something that you were really focused on. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that kind of sort of process started at the beginning of, or sort of the end of 2018 and beginning of 2019. So this was kind of about to finish university. I came across this concept of self-authoring, which the specific program I was referring to was one created by the Canadian psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'm sure many of you have heard of him in the news for political views and everything else, but his work on psychology and goal setting is really fantastic, and kind of undertook this almost like a diary exercise of thinking, okay, well, what if you kind of analyze all of your current very bad habits and tendencies and self-destructive behaviors or anything else. That sounds very drastic, but gives you sort of indication, all the sort of quote unquote bad stuff that you're currently doing, and you're allowed it to really take control of yourself for the next 12 months. What's the worst possible outcome that could be? And then on the flip side, if you could design your own future as to where you want to be in 12 months or 5 years or anything else, what would that look like? And asking those kind of questions is designed to help you kind of come up with a plan that's, smart goals and everything else, something which is attainable and everything else, that will help you move towards the latter rather than the former. And it was the first time, I think, ever that I and my roommate who also did it with me had ever actually sat down and gone, okay, well, what am I objectively or subjectively good at, but also what am I bad at? And it's quite a difficult conversation to have with yourself. I think using those kind of written prompts in the way that I did helped me frame what I was thinking of. I was ultimately really paramount. I think one of the main things I've realized, anticipated about general personal development and learning, and I learned this the most within the context of trying to develop my commercial awareness for applications and everything else, was that it's not, you might wake up out of bed one day and kind of be motivated to try something for 2 weeks, but motivation, when it is kind of certainly touted that way, isn't really, I don't think, the key to making something successful or being able to stick with a habit or anything else. It's all the boring stuff. It's all the habits. It's about, removing any visual triggers to, have the chocolate out on the table, or to analyze sleeping patterns, or find out how you're going to get your exercise or anything else. And I think all the kind of initial effort and self-reflection I put into understanding where I currently was and understanding how I currently studied, not overnight, but over the process of 2 years, has kind of enabled me to be able to do the LPC and a podcast full time, or it's helped with the working in a training contract, and the different demands that brings. So I personally really, really sort of recommend it to anyone. It's how I discovered meditation to help with my stress. It's how I sort of began to understand the tenets of routine, which I'm by no means perfect at, but still try to incorporate today. And just a different way of approach to my work that I developed that I didn't have 2 years ago, really. So I think it's really important to sit down with yourself and have that kind of conversation.
I mean, you were talking my language here. This is what I talk to people about all day, every day. When you said habits, I was like, yeah. And I always think it's really mad that people don't sit down regularly and do goal setting practices. It's like, it's almost like getting in a car for 12 hours, driving without knowing where your destination is or how you're going to get there. Like, it doesn't make any sense. We have this vague idea of what we're going to go, but we never make it solid, or then can kind of look at it and think, right, this is what I actually want to get there. And I think as well with goal setting, I think some people are put off from doing goal setting in case they don't achieve it. So they don't want to have that kind of almost feeling of negativity or failure. I don't think it's about whether you achieve it. I think it's about, learning along the way. Like, your goals change, or you realize that you just have not put enough, focus on them, or you haven't prioritized them. And it's fine. You just learn and develop from it. And it's a good way of getting in the habit as well, I think, of being comfortable with mistakes and feedback, even if it's self-feedback. So it does kind of fit in very closely, I think, to the role of being a trainee, because all of these things you have to be comfortable with, that things don't go how you'd anticipated them, or having, really high expectations of yourself and then finding that they aren't met for whatever reason. So yeah, it's something that I really speak to people a lot about, and think that it just plays such a key role in our lives. And you mentioned meditation as well there. So is that something you do on a kind of daily basis, or is that something that you use at certain times?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird in between. It started off when I was first trying to I'll go slightly further back. I mean, when I first heard about it, my kind of colloquial understanding as to what meditation was that it was inherently religious. I pictured the kind of monk on a mountain humming away and kind of doing all that kind of stuff. Kind of viewed it as a bit of a sort of homeopathic science or anything else. And it was only through kind of just personal experience and using, you know, these abundance of apps that which you can get nowadays to try to help give me a base point and something to kind of start with, that I started out with those really simple, I think it was literally like 2 minutes a day, let alone a longer session, of just trying to learn the basics of breathing, which sounds really sort of weird, but actually being able to kind of really focus on those sensations and understand how to breathe in a healthy and technical way, which was really interesting. And it's quite hard to kind of diffuse that through a podcast interview, but essentially understanding how your chest and your shoulders move, your diaphragm, even your lower back, understanding the sort of depths of your airways and everything, was really, really interesting. And once I'd kind of felt a bit more comfortable being able to do it in a very prescribed, I'm going to sit down and try this for 5 minutes kind of method, it slowly began to translate into, oh, I'm starting to feel a bit stressed about something, or I'm starting to feel a bit agitated about this. And my body or my mind just kind of reflexively goes, okay, let's do the mental equivalent of let's take a minute. And those practices, which I'd sort of began to kind of develop through muscle memory and through proper practice, just began to kind of happen naturally. And so I'd say now where I'm currently at, it's less the case that I kind of wake up and I have my 5 minutes allotted time of going, yes, I'm going to sit down and meditate now. In a way, I wish that might come back more, but it's much more about just in the middle of the job and I've got to go do a phone call or something stressful comes in, I've got to deal with it. It's just giving myself the ability to mentally be in the moment and go, well, hold on, before we do this, let's just take a minute and then let's go into it. Whereas before, my brain, you would be so caught up in what you're doing, kind of firing all cylinders, you just don't give yourself that time and you rush in, which then inevitably makes things worse because you're just panicking nonstop. So that was a really nice difference. Like when I talked about how my working style changed, that was really one of them in terms of when I was a student and I'm just continuously panicking and nervous about coursework and procrastinating and not doing anything. And up in the early hours, just trying to crank things out versus now being able to kind of mentally be a bit more present and kind of still try to practice it and just kind of have it happen in the moment.
I think that's a really kind of interesting. I love asking about people's kind of insight into meditation because, you know, Scottish ex-lawyer, like wasn't particular, was pretty skeptical, I'm not going to lie, when I heard about the whole concept. And like you said, kind of had this kind of religious connotation. But it is, if you look at any top performers, high achievers, whether that's in the world of sport or, you know, business, they talk about meditation. And it's kind of like, okay, there must be something in this. And it was something that I found really difficult to actually put into place because, you know, driven, ambitious, just like yourself, like I'm not very good at sitting still or not thinking. And that was what I was trying to do, like not thinking. And it's not about that. It's just about being able to sit comfortably in the moment and actually be aware of how you're feeling or what you're thinking, how you're breathing, all of these things, so that when you are facing challenges, you're better able to deal with them. But also, I think as well, it can be a really good kind of exercise in like patience and how things don't really matter that much as well. Sometimes I think, God, I don't know why I'm getting so worked up about this. I've got to phone someone. What's the worst thing that can happen? I might say something wrong. I might use the wrong name. Like, is none of that fixable? Like, it's fine. So yeah, I'm really with you. And actually, I found meditation much easier when I tried a number of different strategies and I found one that worked for me, because I think it's like a sport, right? Like you wouldn't expect to be playing football, and if you don't like football, you know, sport's not for you. It's like you try different things. And the one that I found really useful, and I don't know if you've ever done this before, but it kind of ties into that goal setting we spoke about earlier, was like guided visualization. So setting yourself up for like the day, you know, how do you envisage your perfect day going? How do you envisage your week going? All of these things, so that I actually was almost coming out of meditation expecting the best versus my natural default, which is expecting the worst. Have you ever tried visualization before?
I think I've tried it in the morning sometimes, just to try to go from the grogginess of not what's going on to trying to wake up a bit more clear and focused. And I, again, find it really interesting. But your broader point of finding the way to do it, I think, is really important. I think a lot of people who I know have tried meditation and then maybe given it up is because they go in kind of like you said, thinking, I'm going to try this and I need to expect a result now. And if I'm sat down and I'm trying not to pay attention and then my brain goes elsewhere, I've inherently failed and I'm doing it wrong. But the point of meditation, at least as I understand it, isn't to have nothing in your head. It's simply to just be able to actually sit down and take, it's almost like just taking 5 minutes for a coffee. You sit down and something comes in, you go, oh, okay, that was interesting. And then 10 seconds later, it's flown out your head again. And yeah, there's nothing really too wishy-washy or spiritual or anything. At least I don't think beyond that. It's simply just taking 5 minutes to sit down, chill out, which I appreciate for a lot of people, busy people, lawyers especially, if they're logging their time by the hour. 5 minutes in their day might be, I'm way too busy to 5 minutes in a day, but 5 minutes really isn't that long. And I think it's simply then a case of a shift of priorities, and 5 minutes before you start work or 5 minutes as soon as you log off, just to try to, or in your lunch break, whatever it is, just to help kind of mentally refresh and reset yourself throughout the day, I think is really useful.
And although you're saying, when people are very busy, if people are very busy, they need to do this more, because if you look at the studies, it helps you get more done in less time. It, enhances your cognitive function. You sleep better, you make better kind of, problem solving, creative thinking, innovative decisions. It's like, if we want to be better, rather than operating in that pace of fight or flight, which many of us are doing on a daily basis, because we're constantly accessible via technology, we're always trying to cram too much into our day-to-day lives. We're actually in a place where we're in that logical part of our brain versus the emotional part of our brain, where we're actually able to, be far more productive and more effective with what we're doing. So yeah, I definitely agree with you in terms of finding a kind of a style that works for you, and also not expecting instant results. It's almost like expecting to be able to, run a half marathon having never ran before. You wouldn't expect that, but for some reason, because it's a mental thing versus a physical thing, people do think that they just by knowing about it should be enough.
Yeah, it's that old adage of I'll paraphrase it and probably butcher the saying, but hitting a tree with an unsharpened axe 1,000 times and hoping it'll get there in 2 hours versus taking 15 minutes to sharpen the axe and doing it in one go. All the investment you spend in terms of analyzing your current habits, analyzing your current ways of working. I've even noticed this in my training contract, and that when I first started, a month ago, I'd be given a task and I'd go from receiving the task, asking the questions, having my first draft, having a review and sending it off, all within one chunk of sitting. And I realized that doesn't give your brain any time to actually stand back and go, okay, well, what was the actual parameters here? Have I reviewed this properly? Or am I just reading what I think I've written? And had that conversation with my supervisor, went back the next week, had a very similar task come in. And by splitting it up and sort of dividing it up in that way, I noticed errors I'd made in the cover page or anything else. And it just goes to show that I think rather than rushing in and feeling like you need to get things out the way and done now, in the same way in driving 2 minutes, you save like 2 minutes if you're driving X amount of miles an hour faster to get to your destination. It's really not worth sort of speeding. Taking some time to kind of take some time out to understand your current ways of working will really pay dividends.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I said, this is just chatting my language here. This is all day, every day. So I'm very happy to hear someone within the legal profession saying it and like, look, it works. I know it works. But yes, it does. That kind of leads me on to closing with a couple of questions. The first thing I'd really love to know is, what does resilience mean to you?
Yeah, good question. I think at least in my own experiences, I think if anything, it's, I'll answer with a different definition, which is almost adaptability. I think resilience is not being able to kind of shrug off everything that happens and just keep powering on no matter what. I think it's being able to experience a setback and then analyze it, dissect what went wrong, and then kind of change your ways if you need to, or otherwise kind of reflect and go take the lesson with you forwards into what you're doing. And that sentence alone describes my entire experience with applications. When I still have now on my Google Drive, my old applications I read them through, I was like, what was I doing? It was really terrible mistakes, but it was only through actually going through my old applications and rereading things I'd done badly and wrong that I actually went ahead and learned from it and took it forward. So I think my main definition of resilience would probably be very closely tied to that sort of concept of reflection and being adaptable, because I think that will make you actually, I wouldn't say welcome setbacks and rejections, because no one does, but at least take them from being a pure negative to something which is going to be 30% positive, and you can take some value from it as well.
Yeah, I really like that as well, because I am actually really used to find when things didn't go right like really difficult, but now I have a bit more of like curiosity about it. And again, I wouldn't say I welcome it, and it's always difficult if you get like negative feedback or someone's like that was completely wrong, but I'm kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Like I try and make that my first sentence in my head, just, oh, that's interesting, and then kind of like, I think that sets the tone for it. So yeah, I really like that concept actually, and I think it's definitely something as junior, you know, if people are junior members of the team, it can be really, really difficult to get that feedback and feel not take it personally, but just if you look at it as interesting, it might be a good place to step forward from it. And the other thing I would love to know, and I obviously do know that you've, you know, only kind of recently entered the legal industry. However, you know, you've interviewed so many people. I'm sure you'll have a very, very interesting answer here. Is what would your number one tip for sustainable success within the legal industry be?
Oh, good question. I was asked actually for my kind of definition of success on another podcast I did recently.
I love that. That's like my favorite question.
It's very good, because I think you ask anyone, you get such different responses. You know, for some people it's getting this role, it's making this amount of money, it's being able to have this balance and everything. I think for me, I think if you're being successful in what you're doing, you're obviously enjoying it, you're getting value out of it, and you're finding it an intellectual challenge, to use the cliche like we did earlier. And I think you're finding it different as well. I think the main thing that I've really loved about law in my very limited exposure so far is the breadth of different types of challenges you come across on a day-to-day basis. Some from clients, some from other lawyers, some from other initiatives or people connected to a deal, the broader business world. And I think my notion of success is continuously pushing and developing yourself to learn something from the previous week, and to be more adaptable and aware of all those different challenges which can come in, and hopefully be better at solving them or contributing towards a solution for them. A bit of a grey wishy-washy answer beyond just money or power or anything else, but I think that's how I would view success, as someone who's happy in what they do, someone who finds it a challenge, and someone who finds what they do a learning process. I think if you have those three things, then you're going to be really happy and sustained in what it is you're doing. And as long as what you're doing fits within those goalposts, at least in my eyes, I think it makes it very hard to not enjoy what you're doing.
I love that. And I think that's one of the most fundamentally important things, to identify your definition of success if you want to find fulfillment and contentment within your life. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with goal setting. You know, how do you aim for what you're aiming for? And then you find yourself kind of hitting these targets that you thought were what you wanted, or that you thought would make you happy. And then you realize it, you know, that extra bit of money doesn't make a difference, or a faster car, a newer house, like it doesn't really make a difference if that's not what it means to you. It might be, but it might not be. So yeah, I really like that, kind of tying that into the goal setting and looking at your definition of success is another great tip from you there. And the final thing I would love to know is, who inspires you within the legal industry?
Oh, good question. That's a very good question. I'd actually say and although I'm only a few months in, it's all of the, and this is going to sound like a really cheesy answer, but it's all of the students and people who are aspiring to get into the profession, which I find really inspiring, especially because, like I said, I went through the very traditional route and kind of was around people who've done a very similar thing. And since entering the profession, hearing about students from abroad, people who have done STEM backgrounds, people who have worked in industries for, I interviewed someone who worked as a personal trainer for like 20 years and then became a barrister, all these people who are outside the kind of stereotype of an undergraduate student or doing law, no disrespect to any of them because I was one of them.
Also
people kind of like, I guess
this, I did it.
people kind of not fitting the mold, I think is really fascinating, because there's something in those kind of people that's made them go, you know what, I'm not going to do geography and become a geography teacher. There's something else about what I've learned through, let's hopefully not suits or anything else, but kind of some sort of outside exposures to law, which has made me pull across from this main industry into this one. And that kind of feeds in more so to when I interview people who are looking to change, improve, or otherwise affect the legal profession. So design thinkers, I'm really interested in technology, so legal technicians and legal technologists, futurists, people who are speculating about what the law will look like. I find all of those conversations completely fascinating because no one really knows the answer in terms of what the future will be. But seeing their thought processes and seeing how different their conceptions of things, or how my own prejudices are different to theirs in terms of how I view and approach problems and the profession and anything else, just really fascinates me. So yeah, a bit of a half answer with no specific names for now, but that's kind of my grouping.
I used to give people a heads up of this question beforehand, and then I thought it's quite fun when I just don't and see what happens. So sorry,
yeah, it's good.
really mean. Entertaining, but I would agree with you, and I think that's such a fascinating kind of way of looking at it. It's not really kind of an individual as such, it's all of this breadth of people. So thank you, and thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. It's really been amazing, you know, having you here and hearing your kind of journey and about the podcast as well. So everyone will have to go and have a little look. It's on Spotify and iTunes, isn't it?
Correct. Yep. Just search in More From Law, you'll find it on there. And you can listen in on my website, harryclarklaw.com as well, if you don't have either of those options.
Amazing. Thank you. And for everyone listening today as well, please do follow us on LinkedIn. It's Leading Minds, where you will be given the kind of bi-weekly update on the podcast. And also, if you do want to receive that straight to your inbox, you can subscribe on our website, leadingmindsglobal.com/podcast. So thank you so much, Harry, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.